The trucks came before the sound of them. 6 lifted pickups, chrome grills catching the morning light, tearing across the gravel road like they owned every inch of it. Eleanor Whitfield heard the engines first, then the screaming metal as her fence line buckled under 30-inch tires. 2,000 chickens scattered in every direction, feathers filling the air like snow that had forgotten how to fall gently. Feed silos toppled. Eggs she'd gathered before sunrise lay crushed into the mud. And there she stood, 71 years old, in her husband's old flannel jacket, screaming at strangers who couldn't hear her over their own laughter. One of them, a young man in sunglasses that cost more than her monthly grocery bill, climbed out of his truck holding his phone up, filming everything for an audience that would never smell the smoke from a diesel engine idling too close to a chicken coop. He walked past her like she was furniture. Then he stopped at the wooden sign near the gate, the one her husband Walt had carved by hand 30 years ago, and he kicked it until it splintered. She screamed his name wasn't important anymore. What mattered was what he said next, loud enough for the camera to catch it clean. "Who's going to stop us?" "Her." He laughed, and his friends laughed with him, and the trucks pulled away, leaving dust and broken fencing and an old woman standing alone in what used to be her whole life. What none of them understood, none of them could have understood, is that somewhere miles away, a phone buzzed. A man named Duke Callahan watched the video twice before he said a single word. Then he set the phone down on his kitchen table and stared at it like it had just told him someone he loved had died. Eleanor Whitfield had lived on that land since she was 22 years old, back when Walt first brought her out to see the fields he wanted to build a life on. There was nothing out there then but tall grass and an old barn with a caved-in roof. Walt promised her it would be something someday, and she believed him, because that was the kind of man he was. Within 5 years they had chickens, a proper coop, and enough eggs to sell at the Saturday market in town. She never once regretted saying yes to a life that started with nothing but a promise and a pair of calloused hands. She sold eggs to half the county over the decades that followed. She'd helped raise 3 generations of neighborhood kids who came by after school just to feed the hens and hear her stories about the old days. Walt had been gone 6 years now, taken by a heart that finally gave out after a lifetime of hard work. But everyone still called it Walt's farm, because everyone still remembered what he was before he was a farmer. Before the chickens, before Eleanor, before any of it, Walt Whitfield rode with a brotherhood of bikers who never asked for thanks and never got much of it either. He'd spent decades pulling stranded travelers out of ditches, escorting funeral processions for fallen soldiers, quietly leaving grocery money on porches of families who'd lost their footing. He once rode 4 hours through a snowstorm to sit beside a dying veteran who had no family left to call. Nobody outside that world knew his name, but everyone inside it did. And when he died, the club didn't disappear from Eleanor's life. They mowed her lawn in the spring. They fixed her tractor in the fall. They never made a show of it, because that was never the point of any of it. Now, footage of her farm being destroyed was spreading online, not because people found it funny, but because they couldn't believe anyone was capable of that kind of cruelty towards someone so clearly defenseless. Comment sections filled overnight with strangers demanding answers. Some recognized the wooden sign from old community fundraiser photos years earlier, though none of them understood yet why it mattered so much. Local reporters started asking questions the rich families weren't prepared to answer. And somewhere in a garage lined with motorcycles that hadn't moved in days, a group of older men sat in silence, waiting for their president to speak first. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss the next story that reminds you what real justice looks like. Because right now, in a quiet corner of that county, 100 men were about to prove that some debts don't disappear just because the man who earned them is gone. The video kept climbing. Local news picked it up first. Then it spread further, cut into clips, shared by strangers who had never met Eleanor Whitfield but felt something twist in their stomach watching her scream into the dust cloud left behind. People wanted names. People wanted consequences. But the bikers who once rode beside Walt didn't say a word publicly. Duke Callahan, the club's current president, called an early meeting instead. He was not a man who reacted with his fists first. He built his reputation on patience, and patience, more than muscle, was what had kept the club respected for 40 years running. Duke had known Walt since they were both 19 years old, riding cross-country with nothing but a duffel bag and a shared sense that the world owed them nothing and they'd earn everything themselves. When Walt passed, Duke had promised him quietly, standing beside the casket, that Eleanor would never be alone as long as the club still existed. He hadn't expected that promise to be tested this way, 6 years later, by a group of rich kids who thought an old woman's life savings were a punchline for their online followers. He intended to keep that promise exactly the way Walt would have wanted it kept. At the meeting, nobody raised their voice. Duke laid it out plainly. This wasn't about revenge. This was about information first, action second. He assigned men to talk to neighbors who'd seen the trucks before. Others were told to quietly track down security footage from the gas station up the road. A young member named Cole Hendricks pulled up the deleted live stream before it vanished completely, saving every frame onto a hard drive. Within 2 days they had names. Wealthy names. Names that belonged to developers, attorneys, and a state senator's nephew. The kind of names that usually made problems disappear before they ever reached a courtroom. Cole was the youngest patched member in the club, only 26, but Duke trusted him because he'd grown up 2 farms over from Eleanor and remembered her leaving fresh eggs on his family's porch during a winter when money was tight. He worked nights pulling apart the digital trail the rich kids had left behind, cross-referencing usernames, license plates, and old party photos that connected 6 familiar faces to fathers with far more money than sense. What he found didn't just confirm who had destroyed the farm. It hinted that something bigger sat underneath the whole thing, something that had nothing to do with cruelty for its own sake. Meanwhile, the rich kids responsible were living like nothing happened. They laughed about it at parties, replayed the video for friends who thought it was hilarious, and assumed an old woman with a destroyed chicken farm had no way to fight back. Their families had lawyers on retainer and connections in every local office that mattered. They believed money made consequences optional. What they hadn't considered was that some debts don't get settled in courtrooms. Some debts get settled by men who show up quietly, dressed exactly the same on a Tuesday as they would on any other day, and simply do not leave until the truth comes out. If you believe bullies shouldn't get to hide behind money or powerful last names, hit that like button right now, because justice always deserves a bigger voice than the people trying to silence it. And what the bikers discovered next changed the entire shape of this story, because this was never random cruelty. Someone had paid for it, and the reason went far deeper than anyone expected. Duke's investigation turned up financial records nobody expected to find so easily. A luxury housing developer named Preston Hale had been trying to buy Eleanor's land for over a year. She'd refused every offer, because that land wasn't just soil to her. It was Walt. It was every memory they'd built together over 5 decades. What Hale wanted wasn't visible from the surface. Beneath Eleanor's property sat a natural spring, one that could supply an entire planned community with water rights worth millions. Hale had already sold the idea to investors, promising them a resort community built entirely around access to clean, private water no other developer in the region controlled. When Eleanor wouldn't sell, Hale found another way. He quietly paid the rich kids' fathers, men eager for investment opportunities of their own, to scare her into giving up. The arrangement was never written down anywhere obvious. It moved through consulting fees, vague donations to family foundations, and favors exchanged at private clubs where nobody asked too many questions. The plan was simple on the surface. Terrify an old widow until she had no choice but to sign whatever paperwork Hale's lawyers put in front of her. Nobody involved thought an aging woman running a small poultry farm could cause them any real trouble. It had worked on paper. In reality, it had done the opposite. It handed the club evidence, motive, and a target far bigger than 6 spoiled young men filming themselves for likes. Duke didn't call for an attack. He called for patience again, the same patience that had defined every decision he'd made since taking over leadership of the club a decade earlier. Volunteers began quietly rebuilding Eleanor's farm instead, board by board, fence post by fence post. Veterinarians checked on injured chickens, treating cuts and broken wings with a gentleness nobody expected from men built like they were. Neighboring farmers dropped off new hens by the dozen, some driving over an hour just to hand Eleanor a crate of birds and refuse any payment for them. Veterans who once served beside members of the club showed up with tools and lumber, working through weekends without ever being asked twice. A retired schoolteacher organized meal deliveries for the volunteers so nobody had to stop working to cook. Nobody filmed it for social media. Nobody needed credit. Eleanor stood on her porch some evenings, just watching strangers rebuild pieces of her life, and more than once she had to walk back inside so nobody would see her crying. As the farm slowly came back to life, the wealthy families behind the destruction realized public opinion had turned hard against them. They hired expensive legal teams to prepare defenses nobody had formally requested yet. They pressured local police to drop any pending inquiries, calling in favors from officials who owed them campaign contributions. They quietly threatened witnesses who had spoken to reporters, warning neighbors that testifying could cost them contracts or jobs tied to Hale's other business ventures. But every move the bikers made stayed completely within the law, which left the families with nothing solid to fight against, no matter how many lawyers they hired. In the middle of all this, the 6 young men responsible went into hiding at a remote hunting lodge owned by one of their fathers, tucked deep in the hills, accessible by only 2 narrow roads. They believed distance and privacy would keep the scandal from touching them directly. They spent their days telling themselves the story would blow over, that public anger always faded eventually, that money had always solved bigger problems than this one before. They had no idea the club already knew exactly where they were hiding, and had known for nearly a week before making a single move toward them. What would you do if wealthy strangers destroyed everything your family had worked their whole life to build? Tell us in the comments below, because what happened next was something none of those young men ever expected, and it started with a single phone call nobody saw coming. 2 nights before the standoff, Cole intercepted a conversation between one of the fathers and Preston Hale, confirming the payment structure in explicit detail. Duke now had everything he needed, not to threaten anyone, but to guarantee that whatever happened next would be impossible to bury. He spent that final night calling members across 3 states personally, telling each one the same thing. No weapons, no threats, no shouting, just presence, patience, and the kind of quiet discipline that had defined this brotherhood since before most of these young men were even born. Every single rider agreed, without hesitation. On a quiet Saturday morning, without a single public announcement or warning, motorcycles began arriving from 3 different states. Not dozens, exactly 100. No shouting, no revving engines for show. Just steady, deliberate arrivals, one after another, until every road leading away from that lodge was calmly, legally, and completely occupied. Local residents came out onto their porches to watch, filming the procession on their phones, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about in that county for years to come. Nobody blocked a single driveway that didn't belong to the lodge itself. Inside the lodge, the families had gathered in secret to plan their next move. believing distance and privacy would protect them from the growing scandal outside. Instead, they looked out the windows and saw exactly what Duke Callahan had spent weeks quietly building toward. 100 riders, standing beside their bikes, blocking nothing illegal, threatening no one, simply present in a way that made the silence feel heavier than any shouted threat ever could. No weapons were drawn. No property was damaged. Every biker stood well within legal boundaries, leaving emergency access completely clear the entire time. Within the hour, local news helicopters circled overhead. The broadcast reached a national audience within minutes, and by noon it was the top story on every major outlet following Eleanor's case. Reporters on the ground interviewed neighbors who described exactly what Walt Whitfield had meant to this community for decades, giving viewers across the country context they hadn't had before. Comment sections and call-in shows filled with people expressing disbelief that this level of coordinated cruelty had been paid for by grown men, not committed by reckless teenagers acting alone. The pressure on Hale and the families inside that lodge multiplied by the hour, and there was no lawyer alive who could make 100 motorcycles disappear from a live broadcast. Inside the lodge, panic set in fast. One of the young men, Tyler Bridgman, the same one who had mocked Eleanor on camera weeks earlier, broke first. Terrified of prison and desperate to protect himself before his friends could, he handed over his phone to a reporter positioned just outside the property line, revealing a secret recording he'd made of Preston Hale explaining the entire scheme in his own words weeks earlier. The recording went public within minutes, spreading faster than the original destruction video ever had. Hale's plan to intimidate an elderly widow off her land for a water rights deal worth millions was now playing on every local news station in the state. His business partners turned on him instantly, releasing statements distancing themselves before the ink on their original investment agreements had even dried. The wealthy families who had protected their children for weeks suddenly turned against each other, each one scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal before it swallowed their own reputations whole. Attorneys who had been coordinating a unified defense quietly began negotiating separate deals for their individual clients instead. What had started as 6 young men laughing at an old woman's misfortune ended with grown men in tailored suits abandoning each other within a matter of hours, live in front of the entire country. By early afternoon, the sheriff who had ignored complaints for weeks had no choice left but to act. He drove out personally and arrested Preston Hale on the lodge's front steps, live on camera, in front of the very bikers who had made it impossible for this story to quietly disappear the way so many others like it had before. Eleanor arrived not long after, driven out by Duke himself in a quiet, borrowed truck. She wasn't there for revenge, and she made that clear the moment she stepped out. She only wanted to look each of those young men in the eye, one final time, and hear them say it themselves. One by one, they apologized, voices shaking, some of them crying for the first time since any of this started weeks earlier. Tyler went first, admitting everything, including how ashamed he'd felt the moment he saw how far his father and Hale had actually taken things behind his back. Duke stood beside Eleanor the entire time, saying only one thing before the bikers quietly climbed back onto their motorcycles and began the long ride home in scattered groups across 3 different states. Respect isn't something money can buy. No arrests among the bikers. No violence. No property damaged anywhere near that lodge. Just 100 men who showed up, stood their ground peacefully, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own. Months later, Eleanor's farm was thriving again, fuller than it had been in years, with new fencing stronger than the original and a coop large enough to hold twice as many hens as before. Local children came by after school, just like they used to, learning how to gather eggs and feed the hens the same way their parents once had at that very same farm. Veterans volunteered every weekend, Some of them the same men who had rebuilt the fences by hand months earlier, now simply showing up out of habit and genuine affection for Eleanor herself. Preston Hale lost his business, his investors, and every ounce of the reputation he'd spent decades building, facing fraud charges that would keep him tied up in courtrooms for years to come. The young men involved were ordered into community service, and several of them, including Tyler, kept showing up long after their required hours were finished, working the very land they'd once destroyed for nothing more than a laugh and some social media attention. Eleanor never asked for an apology beyond what she'd already received that day outside the lodge, but she found herself surprisingly grateful for the strange, quiet friendships that grew out of something so ugly at the start. She kept a photo on her mantle now, next to one of Walt, showing the day 100 motorcycles lined that gravel road outside her farm during the rebuilding. The club, as always, faded back into ordinary life once their work was done. No headlines followed them home. No parades, no interviews, no attention sought or accepted. Just men returning to jobs, families, and quiet Tuesday mornings, the same as before any of this began. What this story really comes down to isn't chickens, or land, or even the money behind it all. It's about who shows up when someone has nobody left to call, and what that says about the difference between people who mistake power for character and people who understand something deeper. Respect is something you spend a lifetime earning quietly, one small act at a time, the way Walt Whitfield did for decades without ever asking for recognition. Eleanor didn't need saving because she was weak. She needed saving because good people sometimes get outnumbered by those who think consequences don't apply to them. And somewhere out there, a brotherhood built on loyalty made sure that wasn't the ending to her story. What's your take on this one? Comment below. I'm reading every single one of them. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, check out the previous videos on this channel, because this brotherhood isn't finished showing up yet.